Preparing for the Future, Succession Planning and Related Initiatives. Today's September 21. Thanks for joining today. This webinar is being recorded, and you'll automatically receive a link to the recording and to the slides. For this webinar, you'll be in listen-only mode, as many of you know our systems, using your computer or phone, but please ask questions. Find that Q&A window on your system. You know, WebEx is pretty interesting. You can change the screen display. You can make it larger or smaller, whatever you want. You can customize it for yourself. This is brought to you by CCTA. That's the Center's Collaborative for Technical Assistance. So what is that? Well, first of all, it's led by 5 different centers. The CTC Center is the lead at Collin College in Frisco, Texas. And let me acknowledge Christina Titus, who works there. She runs the background of these systems and is responsible for communicating with you about the webinar. So thank you, Christina, for all of your work. Also leading the effort is the South Carolina ATE Center, the Florida ATE Center, and the PI and leader from that center is with us today. The BioLink Next Generation National ATE Center, and the Networks Resource Center in Phoenix. So the purpose of the CCTA is a simple one. It responded originally to requests from the Department of Labor. How can we provide the services that have been developed over many years by the National Science Foundation to a broader audience, specifically the Department of Labor TAC grantees? But it's more than that. Anything that's related to grants, NSF grants, workforce-oriented programs, that's the idea, to get more information out there. What do we deliver? Webinars like this one, and we identify and document best practices. You'll see now many white papers on best practices posted on the website, and we host convenings, and we'll tell you more about those at the end of today's webinar. Let's start with a poll. Christina, let's go ahead and open the poll. Friends, you'll see it on the right-hand side of or the center of your screen, wherever it is. Take a moment and tell us a little bit about yourself. Are you involved with an NSF grant? Both or neither? And then once you've selected that button, you have to hit submit in order for the information to be recorded. So you probably know the answer to this one. It's pretty easy to click on one of those radio buttons and hit submit. Now I'm going to give you a countdown, and then we're going to go ahead and close this poll and ask Christina to show the results. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Poll is closed. Just a moment, friends, you'll see the results come up on the screen. There they are. So it's interesting. Not in this particular poll, we have some of us involved with the NSF, some involved with labor, some with both, but the majority of the folks are not involved with either of those grants. That's fine. Go ahead and close that, Christina. We're all in favor of that because this topic about succession planning applies to a very broad audience. Thank you, Christina, for closing that. One more poll, friends, and then we'll get rolling here. You know, to expand our impact, go ahead and launch. Oh, there it is, Christina. Thank you. How many people are sitting there in the room? Just by yourself? That would be none. You have a colleague? That would be 1. I remember sometimes we'll get in a conference room and get 4 or 5 people around the table and watch one of these webinars. So that may be the case. But we do track this information for NSF purposes. Go ahead, Christina, and start to close that poll. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And let's take a look, and then we'll get started for today. Polls are a good way of us learning a little bit more about you and also demonstrating evidence of our dissemination, like calculating how many people do attend the webinar beyond just those who are registered. So thanks for responding to that. So we're holding on for just a second, and there's the poll. So most of us are singles. That makes sense, and a couple of colleagues joining us. Go ahead and close, Christina. Thanks very much, folks, for doing that. Let me now turn to today's presenters. The most important one, I'm joking, is the guy on the right. That's me, Mike Lasecki. I heard Phil laughing there. I was formerly at the Maricopa Community Colleges and now work on my own independent business. But let me first introduce Phil Santonzi. He's the Director of Client Engagement at Florida Makes. Say hi to everyone, Phil.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is Phil.
Phil, welcome. I'm glad to have you here. And Marilyn Barger, she's Executive Director and PI of the Fleet Center of Excellence in the Tampa area. Marilyn, glad you and your colleagues survived the recent events down there.
Thank you, Mike, and good afternoon, everyone. We're glad to have you all with us.
Excellent. Before we get started, one last poll. I'm making them do a lot of work today, Marilyn. Christina, thank you for putting it up. So our topic today is succession planning, put on your thinking caps. When I think about succession planning, A, I turn to my existing plan. That presupposes you have one. B, I realize that I should have a plan. C, I'm not sure what to do. And D, I cringe. Remember, please select your thing and then make sure you hit the submit button as well. Okay. You probably know the answer here. I wonder how many of us are going to do D. It will probably be me. Go ahead and close the poll. Christina, in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Takes just a minute for that cloud-based system to update, and we'll take a look at the results. We'll get started today, and the question is, how many people cringe? Phil is laughing, okay. Takes just a moment for those results to turn over, and then we'll get started. And there they are. Oh, okay, not so bad. That makes sense, doesn't it, Marilyn and Phil? I realize I should have a plan. Okay, good. Go ahead and close, Christina. Thanks a million, friends. That's important information for us, because now I'm going to turn over to Phil. Phil, what is succession planning?
Well, thank you, Mike, and again, good afternoon to everyone. Typically, when we hear the phrase succession planning, we think about having someone who's available to fill in an important position when an opening is there, when it's needed. As you see, well, you can see the definition there from the internet. But as you go to the, as you see on the next slide, you'll see that typically we think about succession planning for leaders and key managers in any organization. And while that's important, that's not where we stop. Succession planning and approach to succession planning should really apply to all key skills, because a gap in any key skill or function can result in a dip in performance of the organization, and that's, of course, what we want to avoid. As you see on the next slide, there really is a deeper meaning to the use of the phrase succession planning, and that is to embed knowledge into the organization and into its processes and into its systems. Organizational knowledge is the sum of all individual knowledge, but if that knowledge remains with the individuals, it does us little good as far as an organization in terms of succession and sustainability of the organization, and in realizing no disruptions in meeting our customer and our stakeholder needs. I would like to take a moment right now to ask Marilyn about Marilyn, what's your view of succession?
Well, you're going to see my view of succession planning, or my first view of succession planning, when Phil brought this up to us. Phil serves as the external evaluator for our center, for FLATE, and started that after we had been in business for a couple of years, and weren't really familiar with this term in the same manner that he was wanting us to think about. So we just thought about, so what does this have to do with what we're doing in our center, a grant project that we were all looking forward to engaging in across the state of Florida. So we thought about this in this way, but on the next slide, we started doing some research and realized that this could be a complicated business, and in the past it certainly has been, and even in the present, in our own government in the United States, we have a lot of a very specific plan for our presidential succession, going down, as you can see, as far as I could show, is the 17, the Secretary of Homeland Security, in line for our top position as president. So it's always been, there's been a lot of interest in organizations throughout the centuries, actually, on how to pass on power and make the organizations continue to perform, although we don't think of necessarily, might not have thought of kingdoms as that, but that certainly was an organization. And doing a little more research, if you get interested, they had quite sophisticated, on the next slide, you'll see that it's quite sophisticated different ways that succession in countries and tribes and different political organizations approach this idea for how the top power in the country or the organization or the tribe actually pass from one to the other, to the next person going along with that. So I think it turns out that we realized that I guess this wasn't a new idea that we should also, but something we should also be thinking of in our center. And for the more details on what it means and what it entails and includes, I'm going to turn this back over to Phil.
Thank you, Marilyn. Well, succession planning affects the entire, the overall organization, every part of the organization. As we know, an organization is a system of systems, a system of processes, where every part is linked to every other part and affects every other part. On this particular slide, you see a number of areas that, where succession planning has a role and has an impact. In company mission, which is basically the future orientation for basis for action of an organization. Knowledge management is really the approach to how do we retain knowledge within the organization so that this doesn't disappear with people as people come and go. The workforce capability and capacity, looking to the future. How do we plan for what it is that we need in the way of capabilities in our organization, the capacity to meet customer and stakeholder needs. Individual learning and development, our approach to helping people realize their full potential. Systematized processes and procedures. Processes in any organization should really have momentum. They should be standardized. They should have the momentum to continue to keep the organization successful, at a adequate performance level into the future, nearly independent of the various people that might come and go and operating those processes. And sustainability, or the endurance, organizational endurance, to assure that the organization, has ongoing high performance and continuously improves. If you look on the next slide, you'll see sort of a typical approach to succession planning for key skills. Again, now it's not just leaders and key managers that we're talking about. We're talking about key skills throughout the organization. Of course, the first step is to identify what those unique skills are, what those key skills are that have a positive impact on the performance of the organization. Second is determine who or what, where does the pool of people come from who potentially could fill those key skill positions that we have in our organization. Now, determining who these potential people could be doesn't necessarily guarantee them that they're going to move into that spot. In fact, in some cases, they may not even have to know that they're part of that pool. However, when we get to step 3 here, there has to be some sort of a plan for development of those people. And some of those people actually might come from outside our organization, but we still need that plan for understanding how we're going to train them, how we're going to develop them, so that if and when the time comes, they can move into that key skill position and minimize the disruption in our organization. On the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about the approach to succession and sustainability in industry and commercial businesses. And typically, commercial companies intend to endure over the long term. They want to be high-performing in the long term, providing products and services of value to their customers and to their stakeholders. On the other hand, you'll see in the next slide, we also need to address life-limited organizations, and a life-limited organization has a known expiration date, and that's typical of the NSF grants and the TAC grants and other programs, special projects like that. And those, the life-limited organization really needs to look at the critical and key functions that are related to the long-term endurance of the organization, long-term functionality, I should say, perhaps, of the mission and the elements of the mission that are important. The intention of this life-limited organization is to be effective in the short term, but be able to transmit that success into the long term. While the short-term need, for sustained performance is important, the primary purpose of a life-limited organization is really in developing those standard processes and systems, and by integrating the knowledge of the people in the organization today so that those processes and systems can be used in the future by others, again, looking at the long term in terms of organizational life or mission life. On the next slide, one of the approaches that industry uses in succession planning related to jobs and individuals is the formal mentoring program, and I'm sure many of you have seen or heard of these. Where there's an experienced individual, a veteran in the organization takes a new person, a new hire perhaps, or just a new person into the area, under their wing, and basically, teaches them the ropes. There may be a formal qualification system with some sign-offs so that it's a much more formalized development program, and that you're transmitting knowledge in that way from person to person, essentially. Another approach in industry in the job and individual areas, as you'll see on the next slide, is a very formal, a very systematic, tiered succession of skills and knowledge. And I'll give you an example. A company that I've worked with has, in fact, that's the only company I've ever seen is this systematic and this formal. For each position, there are 3 people. There's the primary, there's the secondary backup, and there's the tertiary backup. And the way that they operate this system is that the primary will work at that primary job for 3.5 days a week, let's say. The secondary backup will actually work at that job for a day a week, every week, and the tertiary will work at that job for half a day every week. And that's formal, happens every week. And the secondary and the tertiary, by the way, have their own primary jobs as well. And their backups for, they have backups of their own, of course. But the important part about this approach is that things change in processes. There may be some new technology, new information, and by keeping the secondary and the tertiary, involved in the process on a weekly basis, they stay fresh. They don't get rusty. And so when there's a need to fill in, the disruption to the organization is minimal. Another approach on the next slide is in process or function-related succession, and in this topic, what I'm referring to is actual involvement of the people in the workforce involved, getting them involved in improvement activity, helping come up with changes to processes so that their knowledge essentially is being transferred into the process and the processes get smarter. Of course, they need to be documented. The process and procedures need to be documented so they're available when and where needed by future employees in those positions. But it's taking information and transferring knowledge from current employees and embedding it into the organization, essentially. Okay, so let's look at Life Limited on the next slide, an approach that a Life Limited organization might take in function-related. Now, this is peculiar to the Life Limited organization. It does require a long-term perspective, and it does require that standardization of processes and systems to assure you have that momentum, as I mentioned earlier, going forward and staying high-performing and being successful and effective in meeting customer and stakeholder needs. Now, while I say here that this takes precedence over short-term skills, it by no means pushes short-term skills succession to the side, entirely to the side. It's still important in the short term, obviously, but looking for functions and mission functions and mission elements, and keeping that sustainable over time, you really have to look at this function-related succession planning. And if on the next slide, you'll see there are kind of 3 phases to general succession planning. For the Life Limited organization, is first you need to identify what are those key functions. What are the critical things that we want to continue beyond the life of our organization that have high impact on customers and stakeholders. Once we've done that, then we can start to narrow down and identify what partners potentially could assume and assimilate those key functions going forward. They may have some funding that they can use, or it may fit into their mission as is, may fit in very easily, and so on. And then, of course, the third phase is actually planning for that transfer. How it's going to happen. And in transferring, these the functions, the key functions to a partner, it's important that those functions and the processes and systems behind those functions be standardized, as I was just mentioning in the previous slide. It's accomplished, and that's accomplished by using the personal knowledge of employees to develop the standardized processes so that their knowledge gets embedded in the process, and the momentum of that process will aid the successor partner in accomplishing the function. On the next slide, you'll see another approach for life-limited organizations in succession planning. This, again, has to do with job and individual-related succession, and this is very similar to the industry approach. But again, it's shorter term. It still might involve mentorship, as I talked about, or it might involve a system of primary, secondary, tertiaries, as described earlier. Now, of course, in a life-limited organization, there might be some difficulty in attracting the individuals because it is a time-limited opportunity for them. However, while this is very important in the short term, it does take a back seat, as I mentioned, to the long-term function sustainability. And outsourcing might be a partial solution for some of this as you go forward. On the next slide is another approach for a life-limited organization. This has to do with process-related succession. And again, it's similar to the industry approach, bringing the knowledge of the workforce, bringing the knowledge of the employees into the process, embedding it into the process. Focus here, however, should be on those processes that contribute to the long-term critical functions, which are what we determine are candidates for transfer to a partner or to partners. And again, outsourcing could be a partial solution, although it's probably not going to be a very long-term solution for most of the critical functions. So I would like to ask you at this point to think about how you would react if you lost a critical skill person and had a gap in your organization. You should think about how your organization would respond if a key leader, a manager, or any key individual were suddenly to disappear. Would you continue to run smoothly, meeting customer and stakeholder needs? Would you experience some decline in performance, but be able to recover? Would you experience major disruptions and have to really scramble for recovery? Or, would you be so severely impacted that you really couldn't sustain performance? So if you don't mind, go ahead and click your response for this poll, and we'll see how that turns out.
Phil, let's give people a minute here because this is a little more complicated question, although I see a whole bunch of people have already started to answer. So let's see what it is. I'm interested in the results of this one because I've got an idea here, Phil. Let's count down, and Christina can then close this. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's go ahead and take a look. Remember, folks, on these polls, might be too late to tell you, don't forget to hit submit. It'll take just a minute for go up in the cloud and then to calculate the numbers and send them back to us. So hold on just 1 second, Phil, and we'll see what people have had to say.
Okay.
So the cloud is doing its thing. Oh, that doesn't surprise me, does it, right? Number C, experience major disruptions in operations and have to scramble to recover.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, and that makes sense with the earlier response that we realize we need a plan.
Yeah. Go ahead and close that, Christina. Thank you. Go ahead, Phil.
Thank you. Well, at this point, actually, I do want to ask are there any questions that I can answer, or Marilyn and I can answer about succession? Anything we've talked about to this point?
Phil, we've had several that have come in, and let me bring those up right now. And let me remind folks just to use your Q&A window for the questions. Here's the first one. Realistically, should I set aside funds in some way for succession planning? Part 2 of the question is that an allowable grant cost? I mean, you mentioned it during your presentation, Phil, but how does let's say a grant-funded organization, do you fund this or do you just do it? You know what I mean?
Well, you know, obviously the funding will not extend beyond the expiration date of a grant, of an NSF grant. So you cannot fund the partners, as far as I know.
Oh, I
Fund
meant
the
funding.
partners.
They meant funding the planning process itself, not the activities. I got that, but
Oh, okay. Well,
yeah.
in that case, I see that that it's part of what should be the daily routine or the weekly or the monthly routine of managing the organization. You know, there's got to be some planning, whether you use the logic model to understand processes. In fact, that's probably a good way to take a look at your organization, look at the process model, the logic model. And I use something called the SIPOC, which essentially is a logic model with a supplier tacked on the front end of that model. But essentially, that will tell you, you know, if it's been developed adequately, you know, what your key functions are, and that really should be part of your, as I said, of your daily routine or weekly routine of managing the organization, managing the grant, assuring that you've got the right strategies in place, and part of that strategy is to ensure you've got the short-term succession in place, and looking towards the long term. I don't know, Marilyn, if you'd like to. Marilyn, would you like to add anything to that?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, with full disclosure, that Phil is our external evaluator for our center. This was the next view of succession planning that he brought to the table after we first engaged with work together, and I got over the shock of having to not name the next queen or the next king of our grant program. And that wasn't a sufficient answer to the question of how does this progress. And I think we spent a lot of time talking through what we were doing as an organization, and not necessarily so focused as we grew over the years, but trying to identify the things that we needed to sustain. So as soon as we could translate it to sustainability, we were in a little bit more comfortable conversation about the concept of what we should be planning for. And it also melded well with our whole evaluation plan. So we're going to talk about that next a little bit more in detail. So I'll stop in case there's some other questions.
We do have one more, Marilyn, and I'll start with you on this one. And this came in through our window. It says, you know, small organizations are, in fact, small organizations, and it's people and emotions involved. And I think I see what they mean by this question. I mean, you start talking with your group about succession planning, and then they start immediately saying, well, my job. You know, they start thinking along those lines. What about on the emotional side? How do you deal with it? Maybe just by being utterly open and describing what's going on. But have you seen that play in smaller organizations, the emotional side of it?
Well, certainly in a grant organization like the NSF-ATE project and the centers, those who are engaged in many of those projects that I've worked with over the years at both levels are very tied to each other and very passionate about the work that they're doing together, and also the impact that they're having on students. So that's a very kind of close-knit family, almost organization. And the ending of the external funding is, you know, well, what do we do next, or what parts have we really institutionalized need to be addressed, I think, openly and discussed as a team. Certainly, those who are not in a full-time permanent position in the institution know that they're hired just for the grant project, that it's a temporary position, no matter how long it might end up going on. And in the case of a center, which could be
Yes.
10 years, but in the case of a project, might only be 2 or 3.
Yes.
So I think that conversation has to be open, or people need to be reminded that that's the situation that they're in. The good news, I think, in many cases, those same people that get engaged in projects often become part of the institution in some capacity, similar to the work that they do in the project or in the center, which is kind of a good transition place for them. So I think it may turn out to be more of a reminder for some people that this is a temporary organization,
Yes.
and that our job is to push these, try to find a place for for all of us together to find places if there needs to be, if they're not permanent folks, if they want to stay in the education environment in our case.
Yeah. Okay, that's a good approach, and I know that concerns all of us, right? How do we deal with the people involved? And both of you, Phil and Marilyn, alluded it to you in your private, in your previous section. Let's go ahead. We've got a couple other questions which we'll save for our next break. Marilyn, would you tell us a bit more about the specific situation with your own organization, a life-limited organization?
Okay, thanks, Mike, and thanks, Phil, for the great introduction. He did that so nicely in a few minutes, and it must have taken him 4 or 5 years to beat some of those concepts into my head and into our organization. But thanks for persisting in that. So FLATE is a NSF, ATE Regional Center. We're focused on advanced manufacturing and typically work or primarily work in the state of Florida. And we came into existence wanting to be the kind of go-to place for manufacturing and production industry education and training, and knowing what their skills were and making sure they had a adequately trained workforce. So on the next slide, just to let everyone know what the Advanced Technological Education mission is, we dovetail right under their mission as a center. In order to have the best technical programs for the manufacturers in Florida, we stand that on this kind of three-legged stool. We do outreach and recruitment to get more students interested in manufacturing. That is still a challenge, even though manufacturing has become much more trendy and much more in the public's eye. It's still challenging to get young people interested in this as a career path. And we do professional development for the educators that are involved, both at the high school and the college level, to make sure that we have the best instruction, the most current technologies, and the most current educational technologies for delivering those programs of study. So the students, again, are ready to go to work with the best tools we can find for them. And then, of course, there's the content-based information, which is the curriculum, and making sure that it's aligned to industry needs, and that the students are ready to go to work when they complete the programs is really important. So keeping industry engaged is definitely an important piece of curriculum. It's also important for the other aspects, our outreach and professional development work. So those three kind of legs, we say, help us focus on the work that we do, and we try to package our work into one of those three areas. That helps us with our process thinking that Mike alluded to, or Phil alluded to, sorry about that, in his slides before that. So could you go to the next slide, Mike? So even before Phil became our external evaluator, we were engaged in the kind of quality organizational process. We adopted a Malcolm Baldrige approach to our external evaluation, which meant that we were also not only engaged in what we told our funders, the National Science Foundation, that we would do, but we were also interested in developing an organization that followed the same kind of processes that the industry we wanted to work with followed. And that took us to the quality arena, where we got engaged with the Malcolm Baldrige kind of process and looked at our work at these three kind of levels. So one piece that a lot of people don't get to, but in order to think about sustainability and and succession planning, you have to think at this organizational level. So focusing on that, on the next slide, you'll see we really funnel all of our work at the activity level, which means some of the interactions we do, the curriculum we develop, workshops we do for educators, recruitment efforts and activities, all talk to how we are as an organization, or what we do as an organization, and how we process that. So again, this is to become try to be a more endurance-focused organization, so we can start thinking about sustainability of the individual pieces underneath within our organization. So we, on the next slide, we'll start talking about some of the characteristics of our organization, of our center, at a different level, not what we do, but what we look like. We have a small, obviously temporary staff, since we're grant funded. We have a lot of partners and collaborators and stakeholders, and one of the things we did learn was that from Phil was to really utilize our stakeholders and our volunteer partners. We do have a finite life as a life-limited organization. We have finite resources, and we did want to maintain high productivity even when we lost a staff person, and so how are we going to do that? And of course, having temporary staff, that happens frequently during our tenure. And how can we institutionalize our projects and activities? So this relates directly back to Phil's conversation about process focused and capturing in the manufacturing industry what they would say is tribal kind of knowledge. How do we get the knowledge of those people and maintain it in the organization? So continuing with this idea of what can we do, or what are some of the activities that we engaged in. On the next slide, we'll continue with this conversation. We have two kind of ideas that we bucket this work into. One is we wanted to make sure we could maintain our work and our workforce. And then secondly, we did begin to identify projects and activities that we found had high stakeholder value or impact, and started looking for ways to sustain those activities. We didn't really know where to start that particular job, but we'll come back and talk about that in just a minute. But to maintain our workforce, it's kind of some standard things, but we did think about it, talk about it, and also develop some strategies and some practices within our group. So we developed a lot of shared resources, and by that I meant we developed templates for our work. We developed, common graphics, email templates, some of those things that we all use, and housed them in the same places so that when they went out from the organization, from anyone in our team, that we used the same vocabulary with our stakeholders. We did a lot of cross-training of our small staff, and some of that was done by some of the bullets below here, where we developed or assigned teams and assigned different people, different team members to be the lead of those activities or those particular projects, and then a secondary person to work with them, or sometimes a third, depending on the size of the project that was going on. So those duties rotated, but they engaged not only the leader, but also one or sometimes two additional people, so they would learn how that particular activity was run. And also we managed to capture the process for those. How did we do it? What needed to be done? We developed checklists. Again, more specific templates that went with the activity, standard survey, standard instruments to use during those activities as well. We did a lot of communication, became really more and more important, and did that at regular staff meetings where we all shared the work we were doing. individually and as different kind of sub-teams on different projects. And we developed individual kind of position manuals for each of the job functions, each of the positions that were part of our center, including our student workers, who are, of course, in any educational institution, are the most transient. So we go through those, one every year or something like that. A lot of turnover, but we found that providing them with a manual that the previous student maintained, with some oversight, of course, was a really useful tool. So they could refer to it and not feel like they were always looked down upon for asking questions, and continue to work at a good pace and get their work done. So in the area of identifying for the focused on, so that kept us going and maintaining a high, I would say, a high level of productivity during our tenure, and at the same time identifying this second bullet, trying to identify the activities that have high value and high impact. We ultimately developed a tool that you can see on this on the next slide. So this is a very small picture of a multi-page document, but I'll give you the cliff notes of this tool. This evolved over a couple of years as a working tool for us that we reviewed on a regular basis. Maybe every 6 months or so, we would update this tool. And what you might not be able to read are the columns across the top. I'll get to those in a minute, but the first column is just what is the program or the activity, and you'll see those three legs that areas of work that we engage in the ATE community. Typically, I'm always sorry to leave out the folks who do technician education research, but we didn't do that particularly in our center, so you'll just see these three. And we divided our activities into put them into these buckets. And then across the top, we said, okay, so we have an award system for educators. They're called the FLATE Awards. That's the first row here under outreach. And the goal of that was to bring some recognition to the manufacturing educators in our state that were doing great things and working with industry. We identified some partners that we had worked with on that kind of project, the annual project, and what their role was, and those roles evolved through time. There's this progress column to say we're making progress towards moving this project to the partner's responsibility or to the partner's organization. And then just a column for notes, which we called post-it. Since we had a bunch of P's across the top, we labeled that one just a note column as post-its. So, for example, we decided that the awards was a great way to recognize people and educators, and that it would be really good if this continued. We approached some organizations in the state that seemed appropriate, and actually identified one that would, I'll use the word adopt this project, and we're transitioning the awards to them. They'll still maintain the FLATE Educator, Manufacturing Educator Awards title. They've now hosted the awards ceremony and run the selection process. And this next year, the last phase of our transition is to transition the sponsors of the awards from us, from our center, to this other organization. It's a professional organization for educators. It's the Florida Career and Technical Education Association, a division or subset of the ACTE national organization. So that's kind of been a 2.5-year process of transitioning. We started that early on, realizing that we thought this particular activity had high stakeholder value in our community and something we wanted to maintain. But I'd like to point out that when we made this list, there are some items that we knew would only be sustainable if somebody jumped in and said, I'll support that, and here's X number of dollars per year. So, for example, our our website is not hosted on our college web platform, but independently and without very specific financial resources that somebody would pick up, that will disappear. So going out and looking just for funds for that, we felt had lower priority than some of the other things we were doing, and that's kind of left in the in the wings at this point in time. We haven't really addressed that. So we did some prioritizing and continued to look for opportunities for finding places for these activities that we thought had high value for our stakeholders. Or if others were already institutionalized, like some of the curriculum that we developed and put in place across the state, we acknowledge that in this chart and who the holder of that curriculum was, or what institutions it was being delivered at. We have a statewide system, so some of that is at the Department of Education, that kind of thing. So we included it in our table so we could feel good that this was done and in good hands, and then moved on to some of the other more challenging opportunities that we we're trying to make sure some of the activities we had actually continued. So I won't go into any more detail. We have this kind of framework of a tool if anyone's interested in more details than that. We found it really quite useful. We have an annual review with our National Visiting Committee, and we would certainly spend some time with them on this and look at it with, they would help us do some of the prioritizing. They didn't come up with any money, but unfortunately, but they helped us put some of the activities that we did and were engaged in, and the work that we were doing in perspective from their point of view, which helped us to kind of prioritize how we approach the, I think there's probably about 10 pages altogether in this document, so a number of activities. So I'm going to ask Phil to summarize, and I think we'll get back to some more questions.
Thank you, Marilyn. And one thing about the tool that the FLATE uses, it may be obvious that 10 pages worth of functions or key programs may not all get extended into the long term. They may not be a partner for all of them, so they really have to be prioritized, as Marilyn said, and work on the ones that are the higher priorities. So anyway, in closing, I hope that we leave you with the view, that it is necessary to consider succession and short-term effectiveness to meet the customer and stakeholder needs and to stay high-performing. It's also important, regardless of the type of organization, and as you saw, hopefully, that it is a little different approach in each, the long life organization versus the life limited. It is important to bed that in workforce knowledge into systems and processes so that you can enhance the organizational endurance in the long term. And for the life limited organization, be able to use those smarter processes and standardized processes to transfer to a potential partner. Thank you. Are there any questions at this point?
There's some comments, Phil. You know what struck? I'll make a comment if I can. What really struck me is your last bullet here, that thinking about succession planning and sustainability, it really is a different. In my mind, I'd never quite framed it in the terms of the length or the time horizon. So that really made an important point to me. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Marilyn, I have a question for you, and it came in. I'll start with you, and I might turn to Phil as well. But when you sit down with an employee, this is what the question says, and talk about succession planning, do you discuss professional development at the same time? That is, do you say, if you could develop yourself, you could move up? Maybe that's setting expectations, or have you ever had to handle that, combining professional development and succession planning discussions? Tough question.
Yeah, that's a tough question. I've been very lucky with our center, and we haven't had that many people. My current team, I have one employee who's been with us over 10 years and another over 7. and they both are in newer positions than they were in when they started. And it was more, it was actually that they came to me when another slot was open and asked if I thought they were qualified to move up. And so having had long-term people in those temporary positions is kind of amazing, but also gave me more food for thought, because I always thought of them in the position they were in and hadn't really thought about potential. And it turned out that both of those moves, although we go through the regular college posting and hiring, were great opportunities. So I would say that I got the professional development in those cases of you know, thinking about it in that way. I was reliant on those folks to be there, and I didn't really cross my mind until they brought it up in two separate cases that I think they had the potential to be in those positions, and they both done really great in their new positions, and I was more than excited to be able to pay them more, which is a challenge in education environment. So I think for me it happened to be the reverse. But I don't know. Anyway, that's all I can say about my experience there.
Phil, what about you? From your side, you know, you bring the industry perspective here. Do industries formally talk about professional development in the same breath as succession planning, or are they setting up something, an expectation for the employee, and they worry about that? Do you know what I mean?
Yes, usually it is part of that discussion, part of the same discussion, because you know, typically what I see is the manufacturer or any other organization for that matter, it doesn't have to be just manufacturing, but any other commercial business will, you know, have a discussion with the individual, and it'll be a combined discussion. It'll be a combined performance, you know, evaluation, so to speak, you know, for the last year, let's say.
Yes.
And a goal setting for the next year. And at the same time, and then when you're talking about goals going forward, then it also becomes, you know, incumbent to talk about what sort of development does the individual need going forward to help to be better at achieving those goals, and whether they're company goals solely, or if it's a combination of an individual's goal and a company goal, which is best. You know, if they both have a share ownership in the goal. But yeah, it does. The succession planning is usually, you know, incorporated at that point in the discussion.
Okay, makes sense. We're perfectly on time today, and for our final wrapping up question, you know, many of us in the proposal world are getting ready for submissions this fall, and in some cases the solicitation calls for discussion of sustainability, but it almost never uses the succession planning word. I would guess it's too soon to put succession planning into a proposal. Do you think that's true, Marilyn? You just probably talk about sustainability, right, in that section?
Yes, I do. I've not ventured into that vocabulary. I think sustainability is challenging enough for many grants, and I just made a kind of direct translation to succession planning for us in going forward with the work that we did. I was much more comfortable talking about it as sustainability than as succession planning, but I see the kind of unique aspects of succession planning really involve the people as well as the kind of products that we have. So I think a good plan for sustainability, and I know it's at the front side you don't have anything, so it's hard to think about sustainability. But if you can think about it up front, that you know this is going to be a great great project and a great activity, because we all think that at the beginning of a project that gets funded, that we should also be thinking of really realistically thinking about it instead of doing just kind of, you know, FaceTime to it, really thinking about, well, what will really happen? Will the college really adopt this? And if they do, how are they going to be able to afford it? I think we talk at it, but we don't really talk about it. And then at the end, we're already passionately connected to good activities. That we get fretful about what's going to happen to them and that they'll be lost and gone, and we can avoid that by including it at the beginning of the conversation about what will happen in 3 years or what will happen in 4 years, whatever.
Good point. Well, I'll throw in my own editorializing here. I remember talking with several groups about this concept of both sustainability and succession planning, and their answer was, we'll get another grant. And I think today's information is that it's quite a different story than that. So I know we're all sort of smiling at that. Let me take us forward here into our closing. Oh, thank you, Marilyn. That's a lovely Wordle there with lots of cool things on it. I should have had that up. So we admire that. Now let's go forward, folks. Our two presenters are actually very interested and passionate, as you heard, about talking about this topic. You can contact Marilyn at her email there, or Phil at his email as well. And please remember, www.atcenters.org/CCTA is the website for this webinar series and other information. Our next webinar is occurring on October 19th, and it's all about career exploration. Well, that's a big thing today for students, pathways, career exploration, big deal. Our presenter, Elaine Johnson, PI from BioLink, and her colleague, Sandra Porta, both very knowledgeable about this topic. So please join us. Go to the website, register. And join us in National Harbor at the Innovations Conference brought to you by the League for Innovation in March in Maryland. CCTA will have a workshop there a whole afternoon, and we look forward to discussing topics that are relevant to you. That's the idea. And finally, next summer, not too far away, well, I guess it is sort of far away, Miami for the High Impact Technology Exchange Conference. And those dates are July 27th through 28th, some pre-conference activities and a post-conference activity in the planning stages for Friday, July 29th. Mark it on your calendar, get out your rollerblades, get them ready for doing some rollerblading on the Miami Beach Boardwalk. Next slide. As we leave today, you can't avoid it. You shut down the system and up pops a webinar survey in a different window. If you take just a moment, there's only 4 questions to respond to that. It will help us become better. So thank you for doing that. No action required on my part. It happens automatically. Phil, thanks very much for all of your insights today. As Marilyn said, that you could see how much experience there was behind your comments and the way you organize those things. So thanks very much for doing that. Phil, do you think those apply to both large and small organizations, or maybe leaning towards one or the other?
To both. And the approach, though, what is actually done would be different. That example I talked about, the primary, secondary, tertiary, was a larger organization. A small organization doesn't have the resources to do that level of succession planning, but it still applies to both.
Right. Thank you. Marilyn, I think what was important to us today was hearing your direct experience, right? This wasn't theoretical stuff, but it was your direct experience and how you approached it and some of the challenges involved. So thank you very much for telling us about that.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks, everyone, for attending.
Good. That can close our webinar. We're right at the top of the hour. Friends, thanks for joining CCTA Forever. Join our future webinar series. Bill and Marilyn, thanks very much. Always fun talking with you.
Thank you all.
So thank you. Christina, let's go ahead and shut down the system. Your webinar surveys will